No, it's okay. So good afternoon, everyone. Honorable Member of the European Parliament, Excellencies, dear colleagues and friends of the House of the Euro. Welcome to our central banking hub in Brussels. You know the House of the Euro, bringing together the ECB and many national central banks here in Brussels. And my name is Boris Kiselewski. I'm heading the ECB here in Brussels. I must say we moved in 2 years ago, and I feel that soon these premises will get too small already. So this is thanks to your trust coming and being so faithful in our events, and keep coming because we have a few other events later this week and next week. Hosting the IMF in Brussels is a true privilege. It's already has become a wonderful tradition. And I'm very happy to welcome Alfred Kammer, the director of the European Department, and also his team, including my colleague James John from the Brussels office of the IMF, for the presentation for the regional economic outlook for Europe, for already the third time in a row. And the dense cooperation between the ECB and the IMF is also reflected in Oscar Arce, our Director General, who traveled from Frankfurt for this event today to present also the ECB views in the panel later today. I find the title of your publication very thought-provoking. I quote, "How to pay for things Europe cannot afford." I think we are all looking forward to have this question answered. And first, so how will we organize this afternoon? First, Alfred will give his answer to the question from the fund's perspective, outlining the main conclusions of the Regional Economic Outlook report before some speakers, distinguished speakers, will come from the front row to these seats and be moderated by Sarah Collins, whom I thank very much for moderating this event, and happy, of course, if our conversation continues afterwards. There's plenty of time and space for us to mingle and ask questions. So thank you again for coming, and welcome to the House of the Euro, and especially to you, Alfred. Thank you.
So thank you, Boris, for this very kind and warm welcome, and to the ECB for hosting us here in Brussels in the House of the Euro. It's a pleasure to be back. The year 2025 marks a period of profound transformation in the global economy, shaped by shifting trade policies. For Europe, these developments follow a series of crises, from the pandemic to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. These have tested the resilience of the region. Timely policy action helped Europe avoid the worst, and the region continues to grow. Yet, as you know, the medium-term growth outlooks remains mediocre. My message today is that this has serious implications for Europe's fiscal challenges. Put simply, unless Europe acts decisively to lift growth to a high level, traditional fiscal consolidation measures will not be enough to prevent debt levels from becoming explosive, putting Europe's social model at risk. But let me begin by setting the stage and discussing our baseline outlook first. In our just released October forecast, we slightly raise euro area growth projections for 2025 to 1.2%. However, the improvement is short-lived, with several factors weighing on the recovery in 2026. The large front-loading of exports to the US earlier this year is now reversing, and uncertainty remains high. Tariffs will increasingly squeeze export profits. The preliminary flash estimate for the third quarter, released last Thursday, broadly confirms this outlook. Our medium-term forecast points, as I mentioned many times before, points to mediocre growth due to persistent structural challenges that constrain Europe's economic dynamism. Today, EU GDP per capita is nearly 30% below that of the US, and without meaningful reform, this gap will further widen. Let me highlight 3 areas. Structural barriers. Intra-EU trade barriers remain significant, 44% for goods and 110% for services. Regulatory frictions limit cross-border mobility of capital and labor, while the absence of a unified energy market keeps costs high and undermines energy security and resilience. Demographic headwinds. Europe's population is aging. By 2050, over 2/3 of EU countries will see a decline in their working age population, heightening the urgency of the reform agenda around labor markets and skills. Investment gaps. In several countries, especially in the CESE region, large investment shortfalls are depressing labor productivity and growth. Both EU-level and domestic reforms to deepen capital markets and incentivize private investment are essential, especially for CESE. European policymakers recognize the urgency to act, but progress has been slow. That needs to change. Which brings us to the key question, how Europe is going to pay for the things it cannot afford. So we all know the region's difficult fiscal landscape, high debt levels in many countries, and rising spending pressures. But the situation is worse. Europe's fiscal challenges will become more pressing for several reasons. First, new demands on public spending have emerged in defense and energy security, adding to growing pension and healthcare costs. We estimate additional spending in these 4 areas at 4.5% of GDP by 2040 in advanced European countries. That includes the UK, but excludes the CESE economies, and 5.5% of GDP in CESE countries. Second, rising bond yields are also pushing up interest cost. And third, the mediocre outlook for medium-term growth and labor supply weighs on revenues and puts upward pressure on debt levels. Doing nothing, as this chart shows, is not an option. Our simulations show that under current policies, public debt would be on a steeply increasing path over the next 15 years, with average debt ratios across European countries reaching 130% by 2040. So that's a doubling of the existing debt levels. How big a problem is this? For the purposes of our simulation, we use a sustainable reference debt path that, over the longer term, does not exceed 90% of GDP. This benchmark reflects increased debt carrying capacity in many countries over the past 3 decades. It suggests an enormous sustainability gap. If no action is taken by 2040, average debt ratios could exceed sustainable levels by 40 percentage points of GDP. So the question is how to prevent debt from becoming rapidly unsustainable while absorbing rising spending pressures. Closing a sustainability gap that large through conventional fiscal consolidation alone would be extremely difficult. Without reforms, the required deficit reduction to bring debt in line with the reference path would be almost 1% of GDP per year for 5 years, or a cumulative 5% of GDP. And you can see that on the left chart, the red dot. This far exceeds what past European consolidation efforts have achieved. Successful consolidation campaigns yielded cumulative savings of just about 3% of GDP over 3 to 4 years. And as any finance minister knows, sustaining a fiscal effort generating 3% of savings is an enormous political effort. Achieving 5% would be nearly impossible and would require deep cuts into the European model and social contract. The solution lies in faster growth. In our analysis, we show that even a set of moderate reforms can make a substantial difference. It includes growth-enhancing domestic reforms that close 1/4 of the gap with top performers. It includes taking first steps to deepen the single market and increase the EU budget for public goods such as innovation and defense, financed through joint borrowing. It includes pension reforms to stabilize spending, and it includes measures to catalyze private investment through public investment banks. This moderate reform package would reduce cumulative adjustment needs from around 5 to just above 3.5%, bringing the average debt path 1/3 of the distance to the sustainable debt path. So we are moving down from here to here. And as you can see with this nice curve, the more structural reforms you are going to do, the less fiscal consolidation needs there are. Now, not all countries are the same, and some have lower starting levels of debt or less fiscal pressures to deal with. Still, about 3/4 of European countries would need to consolidate even after implementing this moderate set of reforms. The average adjustment implied by our analysis notably exceeds what countries have committed to in their medium-term fiscal and structural plans under the EU fiscal framework. For instance, the average adjustment under submitted and signed-off plans would fall about 2% of GDP short of our estimates. But let me be clear that more reforms could change this picture. In forthcoming work, we showed that an all-out reform drive could make a significant contribution to closing Europe's GDP per capita gap with the US. This would obviously reduce the need for fiscal consolidation compared with the scenario we have modeled here. Yet, for some high-debt countries, even combining reform and conventional consolidation may not suffice. Around 1/4 of European countries would still need to consolidate by more than 1% of GDP per year for 5 years after implementing the moderate set of reforms. This cumulative 5% is, as I pointed out already, well above what proved feasible in the past. These countries will therefore face hard choices about the role and scope of government given the available resources. And in some cases, that this may mean rethinking aspects of the European social model. For example, if resources are truly limited, providing public services without cost might no longer be affordable. Instead, private financing could be increased while protecting the most vulnerable. Modest user fees for some services like healthcare could be introduced while maintaining free access for low-income groups. Large tax reforms can also be designed in a progressive way, which is particularly relevant for SESI countries. They have more room for revenue mobilization. Privatization of state-owned enterprises is another option to create fiscal space without hurting those least able to bear the costs. The potential savings from those fundamental changes are large. If all European countries were to reduce the share of public finance in health, education, pensions and infrastructure and energy security to the OECD average, they could save up to 3% of GDP on average. So what does this tell us about how Europe can afford what seems unaffordable? First, there are no silver bullets. Most countries will need a mix of reforms and fiscal consolidation. Second, it is time to stop muddling through. Tinkering at the margins will not keep debt sustainable, and it would still provoke political backlash. Europe needs a coherent, ambitious strategy that combines significant reforms with sizable fiscal consolidation. Finally, how reforms and consolidation will be implemented will determine success. Clear communication and broad stakeholder dialogue that highlights the economic and social benefits of avoiding a more painful and disorderly correction forced by financial market pressure are essential. Bundling policies to share benefits and distributed burdens fairly will help secure durable support. And careful sequencing could ensure that the burden of reform does not become overwhelming. Such an approach can deliver a sustainable fiscal path and a more dynamic Europe. But time is short. Delaying such a package by 5 years would raise the required fiscal adjustment by another 1.5% of GDP. And this is too high a price to pay for inaction. Thank you.
Okay, ready to rock? Hi everybody, I'm Sarah Collins. I'm the Brussels correspondent with the Business Post, an Irish newspaper here in Brussels. And I'm just going to introduce our esteemed panel here. On my left, we have Oscar Arce, the Director General for Economics at the European Central Bank. Beside him is Benedicta Marzinotto, board member of the European Fiscal Board and a lecturer in economic policy at the University of Udine in Italy. We have Maarten Verwey, Director General for Economic and Financial Affairs at the European Commission, and you know Alfred Kammer, who's just given you some very interesting policy recommendations from the IMF. And I wanted to come first to Maarten Verwey because I wanted to get your take on what you've just heard there. The IMF is outlining a new sort of debt anchor of 90%. How does that chime? What does it mean for the 60% debt rule? And what do you make of the recommendations that spending is out of control, we need to bring it down, and now?
Yeah. Okay. Now, first, let me start by saying that I'm very happy to see my good friend Alfred here, and congrats with the. For the publication and for your presentation, very well done. Now, I think that the type of analysis that the IMF is doing is obviously very useful, but it also needs to be clear what it is and what it's not. And I'm in particular reacting to your suggestion that expenditure is out of control. So the way I would look at this IMF analysis is very much like a radar for a big ship, and the radar can signal danger. And indeed, if you do not react to what you see on the radar, sooner or later your ship will run into the ground. And I think this is the exercise that has just been presented is very much like that. Clearly, and here I can only agree, there are fiscal pressures coming at us. There are different needs that need to be catered for. Alfred mentioned them very clearly: the defense, but also the transition, and we have the existing or the needs that we knew were there for a long time related to aging. Now, I think the message of the IMF is if you put all those expenditures on top of existing expenditures and you're going to sit on your hands, then sooner or later, and probably rather sooner than later, you will hit the ground. I mean, and I can only agree with that. So I see this type of analysis as really as a call to action. And I very much agree with many of the suggestions made by the IMF. And to be honest, I think most of them, they are on the table. The real question always is how to not so much that we don't know what to do. It's more can we find the right speed of doing it. So I think that is the key challenge. Draghi has said important things on the subject. The letter report and well, we have all that, and now it's time to implement. And I hope that publications like this will contribute to a sense of urgency on this. So there is a sense of urgency, but I would not panic yet.
Maybe I'll come to you next, Oscar, because the European Central Bank has often, kind of warned or urged caution from governments, keep spending in check so we can do our monetary policy correctly. I'm wondering, Alfred outlined there that the IMF expects public debt, if nothing changes, to double by 2040. What does that mean for monetary policy then?
Well, first of all, thanks to the fund for inviting me to be here. I feel at home here at House of the Euro, and congratulations for the very good report, Alfred and the team. I can only agree with the key messages from this important report. So in terms of monetary policy, I think it is important to distinguish between channels through which high debt can affect monetary policy directly, maybe the so-called finance dominance problem, which I think is not a big problem in Europe given the institutional framework. But I do think that there are very important, potentially very powerful indirect channels running through the macroeconomy and the financial markets, through which a high-level environment may condition to some extent the effectiveness of our monetary policy, especially in the euro area. No? I think it's important to first start recognizing that the environment in which monetary and fiscal policy are going to interact with each other has changed significantly with respect to the pre-pandemic years, the so-called low-for-long years, in which there was a sort of divine coincidence in terms of the objectives and the targets of the two macroeconomic levers. Both fiscal authorities and monetary authorities were trying to do the same here in Europe. We're trying to actively stimulate demand in a situation in which inflation was significantly below for some time the ECB target. Now this has changed in the post-pandemic world, and this divine coincidence is probably not going to last in this new environment for several reasons. Some have been outlined by Alfred. The initial fiscal condition is one of a significantly deteriorated level in terms of the public debt levels out of the pandemic and the energy crisis. And also the amount of challenges that we are facing in terms of budgetary priorities, as outlined also by Maarten, are just expanding every often. So from the fiscal side, I mean, we cannot expect much more policy space, at least discretionary policy space. From the point of view of monetary policy, we think that the natural interest rate of this economy is probably somewhat higher now than before the pandemic. According to available estimates, this so-called natural or neutral interest rate is probably higher now. Inflation expectations and realized inflation is higher than it was before the pandemic, and this is probably going to place some additional pressure on financing costs, also for the public sector. This is undeniable. No? And looking forward, it's also important to recognize that probably we are going to face a situation in which supply shocks are going to be more frequent now than in the past. This was one of the main takeaways, by the way, of the monetary policy strategy review conducted by the ECB earlier this year. And in this situation of supply shocks, this divine coincidence between the two instruments is not going to be taken as granted, as we saw during the energy crisis, no? When fiscal policy was trying to kind of soften, buffer the impact of the shock, whereas monetary policy was trying to deliver price stability. So in this context, I think it is very important to preserve policy space as much as possible, because priorities are many and are very important on the fiscal front. And we don't want to find ourselves in a situation in which we just waste this policy space by running policies to counteract each other. This is not a theoretical possibility. There was a risk during the energy crisis when the ECB was warning about the possibility of too strong stimulus coming from fiscal policy that could eventually trigger some counter-cyclical policy reaction by the ECB. Fortunately, this was not largely needed, but it's an important wake-up call. I mean, in this environment populated by supply shocks, we have to be very careful in terms of preserving and using the space in a very efficient manner. I think it's absolutely essential to maintain the confidence on sound public finances. I mean, the last thing you want to see is a widening of the gap between the natural interest rate, the interest rate that needs the economy to perform in a sound manner, and the interest rate paid by sovereigns. We know that this gap may get wider when confidence vanishes. And we know also that higher interest rates on public debt typically spreads through the rest of the economy. And ideally, you want to avoid this situation, because if this situation materializes, then the effectiveness of monetary policy suffers, because central banks can only manage short-term risk-free interest rates. If there is a significant decoupling between short-term risk interest rates and the interest rates that are relevant for other economic agents, we have a problem in terms of the effectiveness of monetary policy. And just to conclude, here in the euro area, we have a sort of a unique problem, a unique vulnerability, which is the risk of financial fragmentation. We have faced it in the past. Is there any connection between public debt management, fiscal policies, and fragmentation, financial fragmentation? Well, of course, there is a risk there. Let me be very clear on this. I mean, problems in the fiscal front have never been necessary nor sufficient to generate financial fragmentation. You may have financial fragmentation with and without fiscal issues, but also to be clear, fiscal vulnerabilities are the most natural suspect whenever we see a potential problem of financial fragmentation. We need to avoid this, because if, again, we face financial fragmentation, this will mean that the effectiveness in the transmission of our monetary policy will be diminished, and this is something that we want, all of us want to avoid. So it's important to keep sound public finances in order to get a right combination, a right interaction between fiscal and monetary policy, especially in these very challenging macroeconomic times.
Benedicta, Marzinotto, I wanted to kind of go back to a similar question I asked Maarten there. I mean, you're on the European Fiscal Board. It's kind of your job to keep an eye on whether the EU is meeting or not meeting its targets. And I wonder, what did you think about the IMF's assessment there, that we're on a path of unsustainable debt? Does it mean that we need to go back to, I don't know, 60% of GDP debt criteria? Does that even matter anymore? What's the answer here?
I agree that the fiscal situation is daunting, and there's no doubt that member states need to embark on a serious fiscal consolidation path to avoid rising debt levels. So on that front, there's full agreement. I would like to be a bit more optimistic. In this rather gloomy picture, I think the good news is that member states have actually committed to fiscal consolidation. They have submitted medium-term plans, which have been approved by the Council, and they're not really projections or forecasts. They really are political commitments where any deviation from the agreed path will trigger an alert mechanism. So probably this no policy change scenario of the average country moving to 130% would not materialize, and the minimum adjustment we are expecting, if rules are being expected, is in the range of 7.5 or 15% of GDP away from this baseline, just because there is a minimum adjustment effort in the rules whereby countries with a debt above 90% need to adjust it every year by a minimum of 1%. So if one accounts for that, we should not reach the 130. Now, obviously, the question is whether member states will deliver on the promise, whether this political commitment will be satisfied. And there's one encouraging fact, which is that most of the member states have sought involvement from relevant stakeholders. That's part of the regulation. It's a requirement in the new regulation that member states, before submitting medium-term plans, seek a dialogue with social partners and possibly present the plan in Parliament. The Fiscal Board has published a report on the 22nd of October where we find that a majority has had this involvement of stakeholders. Now, we're unable to say how deep the consultation has been, but it's already good news that the consultation has taken place. It is actually a requirement that is going to be even more stringent from the second cycle onwards, from 2029 onwards. So considering that most of the obstacles to fiscal consolidation are of a political economy nature, this is an encouraging fact. So I'm trying to be a bit more optimistic. Now, on whether the debt is sustainable or not, and whether the 60% still makes sense. Now, the EC, and these are the weak parts of the process, the European Commission has proposed to countries with a debt above 60% a reference trajectory. The reference trajectory applies to 17 countries, which is the share of EU members that have a debt above 60%. And that indicator, that reference trajectory, is anchored in debt sustainability. And what this means is that it establishes the growth rate in expenditure that is compatible with debt reduction based on a debt sustainability analysis where that debt reduction is necessary. So in theory, that reference trajectory should deliver. what happened in the process in the first cycle, and this is one weakness we highlight in the report, is that many member states have submitted their own expenditure path. They have deviated sometimes, actually only in a few cases, significantly from the reference trajectory that was received by the European Commission. In some cases, I should stress, the expenditure path, the national expenditure path, is actually even more stringent than the Commission's one, but a majority has a more relaxed expenditure path. Now, what we find that is a source of concern is that these national trajectories are based on some over-optimistic growth expectations. So that's something that exposes budget outcomes to vulnerabilities in the case of lower than expected growth, which is something that might happen, of course, and reinforces the view that economic growth is very important to make sure that member states actually deliver. Now, the deviation in these reference trajectories are allowed according to the rules. And it's one of the elements of the new framework that is there to enhance national ownership, provided they're justified with robust economic arguments. So one of the things that the board finds is that the details of that economic argument are not spelled out. So an external observer is unable to say whether the deviation that was proposed by each member state is based on sound economic reasoning. Now, on the 60%, I should say that 60%, and that's my personal view, is not really a common debt anchor. The novelty in the current framework is that there are country-specific adjustment paths that relate to the fact that countries have very different starting positions. And what in practice the 60% threshold is doing is creating differentiated institutional processes. Because, as I mentioned earlier, only countries with a debt above 60% receive a reference trajectory by the Commission. All the others are, in a certain sense, hands-free. They would have to exchange, if they want, technical information with the Commission. Now, I think that changing the threshold that de facto generates two different institutional processes, countries that are under control and countries that are not, is not politically feasible. So if you were to do it today, there are 5 countries that have a debt above 90%. You would have to change the threshold by unanimity, and that would imply that 5 countries decide to be under control while all the other 22 are not, which is something that politically wouldn't fly. Having said that, it doesn't fly politically, but as I mentioned at the very beginning, it's not even necessary, because we have this country-specific expenditure path that should deliver a plausible downward trend in debt, which is what the rules are indicating.
Before we go to the audience, because I am going to come, so get your questions ready, but I want to go back to Alfred to see what you make of all of that. Now, you've heard, don't panic, there's cause for optimism, whereas you're kind of saying, and I mean, it's not that surprising that the IMF is saying panic now. But what do you make of that? And especially because it was sort of touched upon a little bit, but a lot of these reforms and cuts take a lot of political buy-in, and it just doesn't seem to be there in a lot of countries. It is to an extent, but when you try to do a pension reform in France, the government kind of rose back. In Belgium, we've seen, countless, general strikes over the last year, month. Even within the same month, we've 2 this month coming up. So yeah, what's your sense of what you've heard here today and how that political buy-in might come, if it will come?
So first, we don't want to panic anybody. So that's not the point of the exercise. But we want to call for urgency. The European countries, the European Union has a strong institution very strong governance structures which it actually can rely on. But you're pointing to the political reality that making political decisions both on the growth side as well on the fiscal consolidation side is going to be extremely tricky. And therefore we are combining here two things. First of all, and Maarten was speaking to that, there is a Draghi and Letta, and these structural reforms will generate growth, and that will be an important ingredient in order to generate fiscal sustainability. What we see here is the European Commission has been moving fast in moving proposals forward. But it's a question of member countries and political will to move now to action. And our view is there's urgency in terms of generating that income for the European population, and there's urgency because this needs to support the fiscal consolidation part. Second point, and Benedicta was speaking on that in terms of the medium-term fiscal and structural reforms plans. They are in place, and that is good. And some have a bit over-optimistic assumptions in there, and we know that there will be shocks. So in the end, what we are seeing right now is some countries are struggling to get approval of the measures under the medium-term structural plan and to stick to their commitments, and that has already been done. Just to point out on our side is it's good that the fiscal rules are in place. It's good that there's a process where countries are trying to adhere to these fiscal rules, but already that is tough. And I think what we all were reminded this year on was we did a paper in January, long-term spending pressures until 2050. It was nice to look at that, and when you are a politician, 2050 is so far away from your term and your election period. There's something to basically say, I don't need to look at that at all. And suddenly, Europe found itself in a very unfriendly world this year. And one of these spending pressures was moved up on security, national defense. The long-term one became an immediate spending pressure. And countries had to make decisions on how to accommodate that spending pressure, accumulate further debt, do revenue measures, or cutting spending. And therefore, we wanted to bring a more comprehensive approach to all of this, that this is not the only spending pressure hitting us, there are more to come, and there's urgency in order to start tackling it. And now to your question. On the political side, this is all incredibly hard, so there's no question. These structural reforms which we are proposing, Draghi, Letta laid out, they are all difficult to do. They need to overcome national interest, political interest. And we need to find a narrative which policymakers can actually use to tell the populations why Europe is incredibly important for their well-being. It's not an issue of net contributions to the budget. It is actually what you're getting out of this large single market, what you're getting out of this large union in terms of economic benefits. And they outshine many of these things. That's also why we are pushing for an ambitious MFF, focusing on European public goods, and use that budget as a lever to advance structural reforms, use it in order to make progress on European public goods. And when you're doing that, you're actually saving money overall for Europe. So that's incredibly important to have the strategy, which we have in place, but now political action needs to follow. And I think we want to see the same thing on the fiscal consolidation side. Because when you're looking at these pressures over time, they're not going to stop. This is going to be every year where there will be struggle on what to do about spending adjustments, what to do about the revenue side. And when you're looking at a population which is coming out of a pandemic, we see the policymakers' response to the pandemic as a huge success in really preventing big damage. When you're looking at the Russian energy crisis, we see what policymakers did was actually stopping a potential meltdown in some countries in Europe. What the population saw was pain on being locked up at home. What they saw is cost of living crisis after all of that. Now we are coming with more structural reforms, which mean change. And now we are coming with fiscal consolidation. And when you are starting these discussions and you do one piece of all of this 1 year after the other, the population is going to be tired and will just saying enough is enough. So our suggestion is you need to have an honest dialogue. And part of that and our contribution is to lay out the facts. And then you need to have a strategy. And what we know with regard to fiscal consolidation, the earlier and the more front-loaded you do that fiscal adjustment, the more dividends and benefits you're getting out of that. You don't want to be called by market pressures and are against the wall and react very late in the game. And that's why I would say, and I fully agree with Maarten on this one, there is no reason whatsoever to panic. But there is urgency. And then it is important to get it politically right. And part of the politically right is there needs to be fairness in all of this. Yes, I think policymakers have very much understood that whatever we do on the fiscal side needs to be growth-friendly. We cannot afford the fiscal consolidation efforts, which is cutting back on investment. And the new fiscal rules of the European Union is trying to make sure that this is not the reaction function of governments. That's fantastic. But then we also need to protect the vulnerable in the system. And we have to have the discussion actually on the country-by-country level, because social contracts are very different. And what is acceptable as a fiscal consolidation measures in one country is absolutely unacceptable and seen as a violation and a change of a social contract in another country. So that discussion needs to take place. We need to have fearless politicians who are seeing their job as having these discussions. And then we need to move.
Maarten, can I come back to you there? Because I see you jotting down loads of notes. So I want to know what your remarks. I'm just wondering what you make of that. Well, mainly because, look, most of the effort is going to have to be made on fiscal consolidation, right? Okay, unless you're more ambitious with your reforms. A lot of what the IMF is saying is also going to have to be done at EU level. We're talking about joint borrowing. Like, is that a goer at this stage to do more joint borrowing when the talks on the new MFF have barely got going and we're still and we're still kind of fighting about in the weeds of how this is going to be structured as a budget, let alone, I mean, joint borrowing?
Okay, no, a few things, and actually there's a lot to agree with what Alfred just said. I think what is very clear is that indeed we need action both at the level of the member states and at the level of the union, and this action should be structured in a way that it works together. I think that this is the key challenge here. What needs to come at the union level is first and foremost, I think, reducing or eliminating the internal barriers, moving forward with capital markets union, energy union, all that, extremely important. But and then the challenge is also to make sure that this links well to what is happening at the member states level, so that union priorities are also anchored in at the level of member states and vice versa. Now I think over the past years we did there were some, I think, important developments in that direction, making this bridge and also making the link between actually commitments and implementation. I think the first example of that was the Recovery and Resilience Facility, where this link was actually very explicit. So where I think EU funding is used exactly in the way that Alfred just described, to incentivize, but also to coordinate measures that take place at the national level with the overall priorities of the union. So I think that is a good model, and in a way the revised economic governance framework works very much on the same logic. So where we are trying, and I think with some, I'm quite hopeful on that we will be successful to instill a more medium-term focus in member states' fiscal strategy. But also linking it with broader reforms, and actually by creating a trade-off between rapid consolidation or reforms that pay out over the longer time horizon. So I think we're moving in that direction. I'm now going to say something which well, you cannot generalize and may sound a bit weird. My experience from reform efforts that fiscal is often relatively easy compared to many other reforms. There are some exceptions, and I will not point to specific countries, but generally speaking, if you go back to our experience in let's say in the Euro crisis. Generally speaking, countries were actually quite good in addressing the fiscal issues. What proved to be much more difficult is reforms of product markets, and I would say fiscal the easiest, labor markets, and then product markets. So in that order. And and I think the reason why fiscal, I would not say it's easy, but relatively easy to some of the other things, is that it's very visible, and many people understand that if you always spend more than that you receive, at some point, also intuitively, something needs to go wrong, and that typically. Politicians are very able to explain. That's. But again, it's not to say that it's easy. But I think if deficits become too high, I think you will typically see a reaction in member states to start addressing these issues. Maybe one but I want to endorse one point very much in relation to this what Alfred said, and that is the point of fairness. And I think that while people understand very much, generally speaking, that you cannot spend forever more than that you receive, and people are generally speaking prepared to do something about it and to contribute, but only if they perceive it as fair. And if it's perceived as really unfair, then it becomes really difficult. So I think quite apart from ideology or where you are politically, but for reforms to be fiscal reforms to be sustainable, I think that they need to appeal to a feeling of fairness, that everybody does its fair share in these reforms, and I think that we need to pay attention to that.
Benedicta, can I ask you on the idea of joint borrowing? What's your view on that? Would it help? And including with this issue of fairness, I mean, if there is some sort of help coming from the EU level, could that be some sort of boost, I don't know, in some way for fiscal reforms to go through? What's your thoughts?
Just a quick reaction on what Alfred said. I think we're more or less saying the same thing in different ways, because I understand that it's going to be hard to deliver on the fiscal consolidation, which is why environmental factors, growth being one, common borrowing being another, are very important in this context. Now, on common borrowing, I think that it's important to note that the political taboo of common borrowing was broken with the Recovery and Resilience Facility. So that and the common provision of goods, European public goods, is one of the assets that Europe has and didn't have just a few years ago. European countries have been told they should consolidate public financing and implement structural reforms since the 90s. So I think the question we want to ask is what is different now? And the recognition that common provision provides economies of scale and a growth dividend is there as the possibility of common borrowing. And I think there's rising political appetite for common borrowing, which has the advantage that whether you use it for the common provision of goods that serve the European interest, or whether you use it even for just national investment, it would allow to distribute the fiscal cost over time. It will generate savings, especially for the high debt countries that would need otherwise to service their debt and to get credit at much higher rates. So it has these fiscal benefits that will, in a sense, a bit make the fiscal adjustment harder than it looks. So that's the contribution from common borrowing. It will be also especially beneficial in certain areas more than in others. So I'm thinking of public investment in R&D, and it's something that the IMF note is stressing across the board. R&D is especially apt to the common borrowing thing because it implies very high upfront investment, and then it takes time until output is actually available. So the common borrowing would allow to make that upfront investment and distribute, as I said, fiscal costs over time in a manner that is more feasible.
Oscar, I wanted to turn to you, common borrowing. Does the ECB like it? And maybe just a second, very quick one. We're told not to panic, everything is fine. No, there's just a bit of urgency. But I mean, should the shocks that Alfred is talking about materialise, like where is the ECB? Is the ECB ready to kind of row in, as it has done in the past, if a shock comes and it makes it impossible for countries to either borrow on the markets or reduce their debts?
Well, first of all, let me mention that the ECB is constantly monitoring the conditions in the sovereign debt, sovereign bond markets. This is something natural. I mean, we are here to preserve, to help preserving financial stability and to deliver price stability, and stability and a functioning of these sovereign debt markets is an absolute prerequisite to these two targets. So the ECB is monitoring this as part of our day-to-day tasks. And let me also mention that so far we don't see, as of today, any problem in the functioning of any government bond market in the euro area, and liquidity is good in all the jurisdictions. No? I do think that the European Union and the euro area in particular are in a better position today than it was the case 5 or 15 years ago to cope with the consequences of a fiscal turmoil, of a fiscal crisis eventually. And this is due to the fact of important efforts done along two important dimensions. No? First of all, there has been an important transformation of the institutional ecosystem in the EU over the last years. It was the case, the inception of the European stability mechanisms in the wake of the euro area debt crisis. And it has been the case with the introduction of the single supervisory mechanism and the single resolution mechanism. So these are tools that were not here in the previous crisis, and they will not only be useful in the hypothetical scenario in which we face again problems in the future, but I am absolutely convinced that they are already being very helpful in reducing the probability of these events. So these are very, very useful institutional elements. At the same time, the ECB has expanded over time the toolbox of instruments that we need in order to deliver on our mandate. And this implies that today we count on a set of tools that would be very helpful, again, in dealing with potential problems in government bond markets, and also in reducing the probability of seeing some of these problems in these markets. No? Of course, one of these instruments is the well-known TPI, the Transmission Protection Instrument that was introduced in 2022, which is here to help counteracting potential destabilizing dynamics in sovereign debt markets that are not justified by a deterioration of fundamentals. Of course, these are not. This is not an instrument that can be applied in any circumstances, and in particular, the Governing Council would decide in an autonomous way when and how to implement this instrument, and it will also be eventually activated in any case under the fulfillment of some criteria in terms of fiscal and macroeconomic stability of the country in question. But that would be it's a powerful instrument to cope with tensions that are not produced by deterioration in economic or fiscal fundamentals. Of course, the so-called OMT operations, outright monetary transactions that were introduced in the wake of the previous debt crisis in 2012 are still there. And this is an important instrument to accompany an eventual deterioration in some in the macroeconomic or the fiscal position of some member states. This program can only activate it if there is a parallel macroeconomic program signed between the country in question and the European authorities, but this would be and has been a useful tool in the past, of course. And also the ECB has, let's not forget that we have probably the most flexible and widest collateral framework among the main central banks in the world. We accept a lot of collateral classes. That is a good way of producing liquidity, especially when it is needed most by the financial sector. And the ECB maintains an important innovation that was introduced many years ago that has been well traveled, which is the liquidity operations that allows banks in the euro area to access the liquidity of the central bank in an unlimited manner as long as they post adequate collateral at a fixed interest rate. So it's a very powerful way to cope with potential liquidity issues in the financial market. So if you take together all these facilities, in my view, they expand very well the set of potential scenarios in which a fiscal crisis may endanger the well functioning of the monetary policy. So I think we are well equipped to deal with this sort of eventualities. No? On the precise question, very quickly on the precise question of common borrowing, well, I think this proposal has many interesting dimensions, I would say. And I think it is undeniable that the euro area at some point should be able to provide itself with a common safe asset. If we really want to be in a position to compete eventually with other major jurisdictions in terms of the size of our economy, in terms of the size of our financial markets, I think we need to have a common safe asset. So this would be positive in many directions, in many dimensions, and of course it would facilitate also the implementation and the transmission of the single monetary union of the ECB. So I think it's always an interesting proposal. I mean, of course, it's something that depends very much on the political momentum, as highlighted by Maarten and Alfred before, but it's something that definitely should be further explored.
Thanks. I think we may have time for one question. Apologies, my timekeeping is bad. But if anybody has a question, can you raise your hand when you ask it? Can you say where you're from and who it's to, if there are any? If not, we can... yes, there is here. Yeah, there's one coming.
Thank you. Thank you very much. José González Mínguez from Banco de España, here at the House of the Euro. No? I guess what I'm going to do is more a comment rather than a question, no? And it's related to the MFF. No? So there are very good reasons for which the proposal of the Commission, no, to restructure the MFF and to give more weight to what is the competitiveness fund and what goes to finance, let's say, the priorities of Europe in terms of enhancing growth and productivity, in terms of those public goods which are going to be provided more efficiently at a lower cost, like defense and energy, if they are provided centrally, no? At the expense of the other part of the budget, of the cohesion fund and cohesion funds and the common agricultural policy. No? So and also the Benedicta, what she said, no. So this is the moment to front load these necessary investments, no. So let's go in this way. However, I wonder whether the political economy is going to accompany this, what seems quite very reasonable, no, from the point of view of the economic rationale. I mean, countries seem to be very, very reluctant to give up on the common agricultural policy and on the cohesion funds. Seem to be very reluctant to own resources, seem to be very reluctant to increase the overall size of the budget. So I wonder whether in the end will not be that part of the MFF, that part that we should aim to increase at the expense of those other parts of the budget, the competitiveness fund, where this will not be what in the end will not go forward as in the proposal of the Commission. And then what could be done for that to be the case, that this part gains more weight in the budget? It seems not to be enough, no? This carrot of money in exchange for reforms, no? In these national compartments. So, yeah, thank you.
I see Alfred wants to come in.
Maybe as a technical point, including on the MFF, it cannot be business as usual. We are in a very difficult global transformation, and it's a very dangerous world Europe is living in. And you need to use all of the instruments available in order to create resilience, work and growth, and deal with fiscal sustainability. And when we are looking at the MFF, it's moving in the right direction, the Commission proposal. It's providing more flexibility. It's putting programs together and streamlining it. It's focusing on competitiveness. We have wished for a higher increase in European public goods because they're needed for Draghi and Letta. They're needed for the growth ambitions of Europe. And as Benedicta said, it's saving money to do it at the European level. And we also supported to finance the increase. We suggested a doubling of European public goods spending to finance that through common debt. And Benedicta pointed out very nicely why there are very good arguments on doing that. But that saves money overall for Europe. So for us, there needs to be change in the MFF, and people need to be ready to embrace that. And whenever you do change, it's tough for all involved, and one needs to get used to it. But this is not the old world we are living in, where you can have marginal adjustments and hope for the best. Either you prepare yourself and you tackle the issue and you're using the instruments and you forge forward, or you are facing the consequences.
Anyone else want to come in from the panel on that?
Yeah, maybe quickly. If you keep the size of the budget unchanged and just alter the composition, of course, you're going to have political opposition from those that benefit from the cap and cohesion funds, which is why I did mention common borrowing, because the alternative is to increase the size of the budget by raising national contributions to the budget, where you would have political resistance. To overcome the political resistance of an immediate increase in national contributions that will also increase the debt. They might be SGP neutral, but they do increase the debt of the individual countries. Then you go for common borrowing. At least you postpone into the future either the need for a higher national contributions, or you have at least time to collect so-called genuine own resources, and then there's no fiscal cost imposed upon the individual members.
Any other questions from the audience? I don't see any. I just have one more question, actually. Just can I be cheeky? Because Benedicta mentioned the own resources, and I didn't ask you, Maarten, but I mean, we haven't even gotten there yet, but it seems to be a kind of no-no. We're talking, it seems to be with some countries, they would rather increase their direct contribution to the EU budget than agree to own resources based on, climate change or corporate tax or whatever. We're talking about even customs handling fees. Wow, where are we going to land on it all, do you think?
I'm really not the right person to ask this question, but it's it has a long tradition. That indeed the own resources are indeed, generally speaking, more complicated than a direct contribution, which to my mind is a bit of a pity, because it also creates some self-inflicted pain on member states, at least in some member states, and including in the one that I know best. We have every so many years a very complicated political situation about the next MFF, which is and if you look at the absolute amount and you compare it to other elements from the national budget, it's relatively modest, but it gets an outsized political attention, and the question is a bit who is benefiting for that. So I would almost from a perspective of self-preservation, I mean, one could make one's own life a lot easier, not to have that discussion every 7 years in that intensity, and in that sense, indeed, own resources help. But okay, I also know that it's generally speaking considered, at least in some parts of Europe, as extremely sensitive. So we'll see where. I cannot predict where it lands. I probably have to stay out for that.
Fair enough. Last call for questions. Otherwise, I'll give you more time to talk to the panel and amongst yourselves after. Nope. Well, it remains for me then to thank the panellists, Oscar Arce from the European Central Bank, Benedicta Marzinotto from the European Fiscal Board, Maarten Verwey from the European Commission, and Alfred Kammer from the IMF. Thanks a million, and thank you to you all.